Thank you very much, Andre. We appreciate your efforts at such short notice as well. Okay, now we have our Christian speaker, and that is Reverend Richard Winia. If you would come forward, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon, this evening. As you've heard, the topic for our discussion is a just and merciful God. I'm going to read from God's Word, first of all, from the book of Genesis, and a story about Abraham, whom both Christians and Muslims know and revere. Genesis chapter 15. Now, the title of the chapter is God's Covenant with Abram. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me? Since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. And the Lord said to him, Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace, and be buried at a good old age. In the fourth generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set, and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared, and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, and said, To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. It's important that when we speak about God, when we speak about God's character, we read from His Word, because that's where God tells us who He is and what He's like. And also in His Word, He says to us that He is just and merciful. Now for us, those are contradictory qualities. When I'm teaching what we call catechism class in our church, when I'm teaching the children of the church, and we talk about the justice and the mercy of God, then I ask them, well, if you were, and one of these young men who came from our church can speak personally about that, and recently he had a speeding ticket. So if you're driving your car and you're going faster than the speed limit and the policeman pulls you over and the policeman is just, what will he do? Well, of course, he's going to give you a ticket. He's going to give you whatever the full measure of the law requires. That's what a just policeman acting justly is going to do. But what if the policeman is merciful to you? Well, then he's going to forgive you. He's not going to give you a ticket. He's going to let you off easy. And that's how we understand justice and mercy. Justice means you're going to be held accountable. You will pay the full penalty that the law requires for your law breaking. And mercy means the opposite. You're going to be forgiven. You will not be held accountable for breaking the law. And so for us, it's one or the other. God will either treat us justly, or God will deal with us mercifully. And what happens to us depends on whether God decides on that moment when we stand before Him, whether God decides to deal with us justly or mercifully. But God says in His Word, He is both merciful and just. When He revealed His name, His character to Moses in Exodus 34, He said, the Lord, Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet He does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. God's mercy does not conflict with or cancel out His justice. God's justice does not cancel out or overrule His mercy. God acts justly even when He deals with us mercifully. God acts mercifully even when He deals with us justly. That's very hard for us to understand, and therefore hard to accept. That may be in part because we as creatures can't fully understand God's ways, and in particular, how His justice and His mercy relate to each other, how they cooperate with each other. It's also, we can't understand it also, we can't accept it also, because we have our own ideas about what God is like, and how God should behave, and how we should worship Him. We have our own definitions and our own concepts of justice and mercy, and our own ideas about how God should act if He's going to treat us justly, and how God should act if He's going to treat us mercifully. But God is God. It's absolutely necessary that we think about God and we consider what God does, we evaluate what God does, not on our terms, but on God's terms. And even if we can't fully understand what God tells us about Himself, that we accept that in faith, in submission. God is not subject to any human concept or ideal of justice or mercy. He's the one who defines justice and mercy. He is just. He is merciful by definition. That means whatever He does by definition is just and is merciful. So the most helpful thing for us to do, the most important thing, is to strive to know God as He reveals Himself in His Word. Also, when it comes to His justice and mercy. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to take that story that we read a little while ago from Genesis 15 about Abraham in the book of Genesis, where God reveals, where God demonstrates His justice and His mercy in a single act and in a single promise, a wonderful promise. When God called Abraham, he was living in Ur of the Chaldeans. He said, leave your country, leave your family, leave your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you. When God did that, God gave him a command to leave. God also gave him a promise. He said, I will make you, Abraham, a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all people on earth will be blessed through you. So when we say God gave him a command, God made a promise, then we say God made a covenant. God made a covenant with Abraham. I'm sure you've been hearing about covenants recently. That's what Mr. Scaring has said to me. The structure of a covenant. How covenants are two-sided agreements, and in this case between God and man. In a covenant, in every covenant of marriage also, there are promises and there are obligations. There are things we promise to do for one another. There are things we expect the other to do for us. And in this covenant between God and man, there are blessings and there are curses. God has always related to man in that way, in the context, in the structure of a covenant, starting with Adam all through history. He still relates to his people today in the context of that two-sided agreement, that covenant. The Holy Bible compares God's covenant with us to marriage and to the relationship between a father and his children, to adoption. And that tells us that God wants the relationship between us and Him to be an intimate relationship, a close relationship of love and faithfulness, like a marriage, like the relationship between a father and his children. Again and again, God says to His people in the Bible, I will be your God, and you will be my people. But because God relates to His people in that way, in terms of a covenant, that means there's a condition involved. That's the nature of a covenant. All covenants have two sides. When you make a covenant with someone else, it's kind of like a contract that you make with them. And in a contract, you have to keep your promises. You have to keep your side, your obligations. You have to fulfill your obligations. And if you break the covenant, if you're not faithful, instead of receiving the benefits, the blessings, you receive the penalties. You receive the curses. In order to receive the blessings that God has promised in His covenant, His people have to be faithful to Him. Again, just like in a marriage, or in the relationship between a father and his son. In order to enjoy the blessings of that relationship, in order to receive what God promises, His people have to believe in Him. They have to obey Him. They have to fear Him alone. Now, Abraham had a difficult task from the Lord. Abraham was 75 years old when the Lord called him. He had no children. And the Lord had promised him he was going to have many descendants. 75 years old. Abraham believed God's promises, and therefore he obeyed God's command. He left Ur, he traveled to that land. And then he waited there for God to keep that promise, to give him many children. And you remember that he was 75 years old. God said he's going to have many descendants. Then you understand it was getting hard for Abraham to keep believing the promise, to wait for God to give him those children. And as the years went by, of course, that got harder and harder, because his wife and he were getting older and older. And they knew just as well as we do, old people don't have children. And the Lord knew that Abraham was struggling. So He came to him, just as we read, He came to him in a vision one night in order to encourage him. You could tell by the words that He said to Abram when He began to speak. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. I am your very great reward. And you notice the language the Lord uses there is very personal language, very intimate language. I myself am your great reward. Not some things, not some life finally in and of itself, but life with me, life in this fellowship. That is what I promise you. And Abram told the Lord really how he was struggling with those promises. Oh, sovereign Lord, what can you give me? I'm more than 75 years old. We still have no children. And the one who's going to inherit my estate is one of my servants, Eliezer of Damascus. The Lord said to him, this man will not be your heir. A son coming from your own body will be your heir.